Geopolitical Catastrophe. Part 1. No signs whatsoever predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union to Helyu and Mare. In their view, the Soviet armed forces were strong and capable of development. The evening universities of Marxism-Leninism were teeming with listeners. People, especially those damned intellectuals, as educated folk were called after the October riot of 1917, crowded the doors of the Communist Party's district committees, eager to join the ranks. Life in the socialist camp, a favorite expression of Comrade Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, was tolerable. Yes, life in that country was boring, but tolerable nonetheless. Famine was unknown, clothes were on one's back, and vodka was cheap, but women surrendered only out of pure love. Helyu and Mare's lives were no exception in this regard. Not at all. On the contrary, they were under the impression that they lived in a happy time, even though both were spinsters. Nothing predicted that for them, as for the Soviet Union, a geopolitical catastrophe lay ahead. Helyu lived in the Old Town, in a house located near the town hall. Her one-room apartment was on the second floor. It included a small kitchen, a hallway, a bathroom, and a tiny balcony with a forged iron railing. In the center of the railing was the shape of a heart bent from an iron bar, giving the balcony a slightly naughty, sentimental hue, especially when the lady of the house sat or stood there, leaning against it. On warm summer evenings, before sunset, Helyu often sat for a long time, dreamily, on the balcony and smoked. She smoked beautifully, elegantly. Incidentally, during the so-called Soviet era, few women smoked, but those who did smoked beautifully, elegantly. Helyu sat on the balcony, the heart shape exactly at chest height, and smoked. At sunset, few people moved through the Old Town. The city seemed to be tucking itself in, and even those townspeople who were late heading home stepped quietly and spoke in hushed voices, as if afraid to disturb the peace and silence of the slumbering Old Town. Occasionally, a young man in a light shirt would stride down the street and, noticing the romantic female figure on the balcony, would smile. Helyu responded with a barely perceptible inner smile, much like the Mona Lisa. Helyu was pleasant in appearance, handsomely thin, with an expression slightly stern yet virginal at first glance. Her beautiful, strong, well-developed chest spoke, however, not of a tender spring, not of a blossoming spring of life, but of summer, a lush and tranquil midsummer. Helyu, a primary school music teacher, loved to visit the cafe located on the first floor directly below her apartment. This cafe was like an extension. No, not like an extension. It was an extension of Helyu's daily life. The cafe gave life color and beauty, offering peace of mind. Quiet music played in this cafe. Words of love were whispered at corner tables. Occasionally, a middle-aged musician in a neat suit with a solid hairstyle and modest demeanor would strum a guitar or play the accordion in the corner, providing so-called live music. This live musician earned 1 ruble per hour for his music. In those days, they knew how to appreciate talent, and not just with words or certificates of merit, but with the ruble. Other times, the sounds of a piano would drift down from the upper floor into the cafe. Helyu was giving piano lessons to a teenage girl to supplement her salary. This 10-year-old girl was quite untalented, but by nature capricious and arrogant. She considered herself wealthy because her father was the manager of a large industrial goods wholesale warehouse. Such a position in the Soviet era allowed one to buy, sell, and exchange, earning a hefty middleman's profit. Often, when Helyu finished the piano lessons, she left the girl to practice in the room alone, while she herself descended to the first floor, to the cafe, to sit over a cup of coffee and chat with her friend Mare. At the same time, she would monitor her students' exercises, memorizing mistakes and wrong notes, so that upon returning upstairs, she could make the necessary remarks and give instructions. But the trouble was that the girl, once left alone, would start banging away at the piano, thinking her teacher couldn't hear her. Sometimes Helyu scolded the girl, reproaching her for not taking her studies seriously. But the girl would answer cheekily, "You don't know anything, you old maid. My father can get anything for money." Teacher Helyu could have reconciled herself with the girl's ruckus at the piano, but Helyu's neighbors were not so willing. Mrs. Vieira, a pensioner living in the neighboring apartment, stopped greeting Helyu on the stairs and was grumpy because the piano sounds coming through the wall disturbed her afternoon nap. The young family living above Helyu, whose toddler's screams could be heard below, was more patient and did not complain. Only when the students' banging had lasted too long would the resourceful young couple start rolling dumbbells across the floor. The dumbbells rolled thunderingly from one corner of the ceiling to the other, giving the resident below a clear signal that it was time to end her piano moonlighting. Helyu would have gladly given that spoiled girl a slap on the bottom and sent her packing, but a teacher's salary was meager, and the extra income was desperately needed. Helyu was just finishing a cigarette on the balcony when the doorbell buzzed in the hallway. She extinguished the cigarette and hurried to open the door, putting on a joyful, kind smile. The student arrived, the capricious girl. The piano exercises could begin. First, finger exercises, then wrist placement, the scale, and then simple tunes, etudes. Having finished the academic hour, Helyu gave her naughty student strict instructions and told her to repeat what she had learned on her own for another hour. She herself descended to the cafe. The cafe was a daily, or rather nightly, meeting place for Helyu and her friend Mare. The appearance of this lady, a woman approaching 40, is difficult to describe because she constantly changed it. Once she was a brunette, then a redhead or a blonde. She also constantly adjusted her quite lush breasts into different positions, sometimes close together so that even a thin gold chain couldn't fall between them. Then the two mounds would sit at a fair distance from each other, sometimes higher, sometimes lower. And why bother describing her? Who among us men does not know single or naughty women of such an age? Mare was an English philologist pedagogue by training and a high school English teacher by profession. The cafe itself needs no description. It was a cafe like any other of that time, a rectangular hall with about 20 tables for 4, chairs with soft seats, a small vase on the table, sometimes with a live flower. Next to the vase, a menu. Napkins were absent. There was no bar counter. The waitresses took the order and slipped into the back. There, hidden from the guests' eyes, the bartender poured the ordered, or rather the necessary, amount of cognac, vodka, liqueur, or wine, mixed the cocktail. There, coffee was poured into cups. Potato salad and rhubarb cake, or a Moscow bun, were placed on a tray. Why it was called a Moscow bun is unknown. Anyway, later, after Estonia's restoration of independence, these buns were already called cream buns on the menu, and they were indeed cream buns, fluffy, crumbly, browned, with a thin layer of yellowish cream inside. Incidentally, older people knew to say that before the Second World War, during the time of the Republic of Estonia, these buns also bore the name cream bun. In this cozy place, the cafe on the ground floor of her home, Helyu and Mare engaged in philosophical discussions over a glass of liqueur and a cup of coffee on topics of interest to both ladies, which was mainly love. The conversation was mostly led by Helyu, because Mare, while trying to appear bright and vivid on the outside, was internally dreamy and hesitant. Only her soul yearned for beautiful, passionate, self-oblivious love. Helyu moistened her lips with the syrupy sweet liqueur, took a sip of coffee, looked vaguely at Mare and said, as if continuing a conversation left unfinished last time, "How does love arise?" Without waiting for an answer, she continued, "Much has been written and said about love, but so far only one indisputable truth is known about matters of love, that this very secret is great. Everything else that has been written and said about love has not been a solution to the question, but only its posing. Mare gestured with her head to the left. You see there, at the corner table? Apparently a pair in love. Helyu slowly turned her head and looked, as if, by the way, seeing nothing, toward the corner table. There truly sat a couple. A young man well over 30 and a woman of about the same age. The woman was beautiful, with regular features and thick chestnut hair. The man was not very attractive, rather unintelligent. Helyu directed her gaze back to her table companion, looked her friend in the eye, and her eyes expressed expectation, a hope to learn the truth of love. It is incomprehensible to me why this woman did not fall in love with someone else, a man more suitable for her in terms of external but perhaps also spiritual qualities, but fell in love specifically with this mug. But perhaps he has other qualities, completely invisible and unknown to us, Mare argued. A man is not judged solely by superficial, often irrelevant external features. And love. It seems to me that no one has yet correctly described love, and it is hardly possible to describe this joyful, tender, agonizing feeling. And whoever has felt it, even once, will not begin to convey it in words. Why long introductions, descriptions? Why unnecessary eloquence? Love should be limitless, indescribable, and inexplicable in words. A surrender immediate, fast, and insane. Helyu looked at her friend as if the latter had lost her mind and gone mad with lust. At the same time, unexpectedly, Helyu realized with a searing pain in her heart how useless, petty, and deceptive everything in her life had been that prevented her from loving. Only now did she realize that when one loves, one must, in one's considerations regarding that love, proceed from something higher and more important than happiness or unhappiness, sin or virtue in their usual sense, or else one must not consider it at all. When love possesses you, when you are inside love, then, like a jump into water in an unknown place, you must give yourself over to fate. At the moment in time described in this work, fortune, fate, or chance had given Helyu an admirer, Helmut, a junior researcher at the Institute of Literature, about 45 years old. Helyu's previous suitor, a married man, had long since disappeared somewhere, and now Helmut replaced him, and had been doing so for a little over 2 months. But the feeling of love had not yet been sparked in Helyu by the new suitor, although Helmut's appearance would have completely satisfied any other lady past middle age, despite the fact that he looked like a beanpole, and his Adam's apple was too prominent, bobbing up and down constantly while he spoke. But despite everything, he was still an intellectual, writing a dissertation for a candidate of sciences degree, and therefore felt himself to be a head taller than the average person. Scientific work aside, junior literary scholar Helmut had been given a task at the institute, so to speak, as his paid work, to write a report on a certain writer, Pyotr Afanasyevich, who appeared in Russia in the late 1930s, and his 2 ideologically mature works of socialist realism. First, the junior literary scholar was tasked with giving a theoretically grounded, positive assessment of Pyotr Afanasyevich's work, Lenin and the Female Proletarians, and then writing a report on Afanasyevich's second immortal work, Lenin Strokes Children's Heads. When junior researcher Helmut stepped through the cafe door, Helyu and her friend Mare had already taken their seats at the table. In his usual place, opposite Mare, sat Mare's admirer, Elmar, a lecturer in the political economy of socialism at the Pedagogical Institute. Elmar was a relatively young man, a bit over 40, with a sparse, as if plucked, academic beard, wearing canvas dark yellow trousers and a new blue jacket. Elmar liked to drink more than was generally customary. He also had a slightly bloated face, but in nature and speech, he was quite an attractive bachelor. Although, yes, His belly was larger than necessary, and he was also a tiny bit shorter than Mare. Helmut stepped to the table, and just like in a foreign film, kissed Helju's hand as a cavalier, nodded to Mare, patted Elmar on the shoulder, and sat in the free chair. He beckoned the waiter, authoritatively and grandly, 100 grams of cognac and coffee. The ladies had already ordered and paid for their drinks. Elmar's vodka glass was half full. To Helju, such extreme politeness from Helmut seemed overdone. She lifted her coffee cup to hide an ironic smirk. Moron. Helju considered herself a maximalist, wishing to see an ideal man before her, beside her. She found them and was disappointed. Found them and was disappointed. Mare slid her gaze over her friend's new admirer and thought to herself with inner irony, "Your ears are like a donkey's, but if at least everything else were like a donkey's, one could even be satisfied." At the same time, wishing to appear charming, the lady maintained an expression of unfeigned interest and respect toward her tablemates. Helmut immediately began talking about his scientific work, a dissertation on the topic, "The Fertilizing Influence of the Russian Language and the Development of Estonian Colloquial Speech." But Helju interrupted him with a smirk. "Helmut, why more scientific work? Why literary linguistic research? The title of the dissertation already gives a clear answer to your research. The Russian language fertilizes Estonian colloquial speech." Helmut was visibly flustered, but to maintain the solid aura of a scientific worker before the ladies and not to enter into an unseemly argument with them, he said mildly, "The conclusion and the answer to the theme are indeed given in advance, but it must be justified, comprehensively and scientifically. In fact, my daily work is still the study of the works of the socialist realist writer Pyotr Afanasyevich." Elmar intervened in the talk. "Helmut, you could tell us more about the classics of Russian literature. To hell with that Pyotr Afanasyevich." Elmar knew in advance that now Helmut would talk for a long time, and he could sit quietly, because no one cared about his political economy of socialism anyway. Helmut assumed a serious expression, gathered his thoughts, smacked his lips for a moment, preparing for a longer performance, and began. "Undoubtedly, Pyotr Afanasyevich was no titan of socialist realism. That was still Maxim Gorky, the founder of socialist realism as a new literary movement suitable for Soviet society." Political economy lecturer Elmar raised his head from his vodka glass and said with irony in his voice, "Gorky hammered away at Dan Tsarism and imperialism in his works, and thereby achieved worldwide fame. After the October riot, he praised socialism and the OGPU, idealized communism and Marxism. But can any of you name Gorky's works of socialist realism?" The table sat in hesitant silence. No one could name Gorky's works imbued with socialist realism. The political economist said with a malicious smirk, "You can't know them, because after Gorky's death, or his being done to death, devil knows those Bolshevik affairs, Gorky's socialist realist writings were banned and are banned to this day. Let's talk instead about Dostoevsky, because idiots are appreciated under every government, but still, I find that Chekhov's works are best suited for literary conversation. His immortal short stories, tales, plays, that is true classicism." A man of unremarkable appearance, sitting at the next table reading a newspaper, looked carefully over the edge of the paper toward the table, paused his gaze on the political economist, and immersed himself back in the newspaper. Junior literary scholar Helmut was inspired by Elmar's words and continued beautifully, "My ladies, have you read or seen Anton Pavlovich Chekhov's play, The Seagull, in the theater? Did you like that stage piece?" Helmut's gaze slid inquiringly over the ladies. "But Helmut, we don't go to the Russian theater. We watch operettas at the Estonia theater," Mare said, as if reproachfully and with annoyance. Helju nodded in confirmation of her words. "My ladies!" Helmut's voice expressed pathos. But The Seagull is Chekhov's classic, a world-famous play. In fact, it's not about a seagull, a crow, or a magpie, but it is a dramaturgical device, a literary find. A dead, killed, murdered seagull is just like a woman. Helmut caught his breath and said, "Want me to briefly describe the action of the play? Its tragic events, although it is a comedy. But in life, tragedy and comedy are side by side. Often, it is even impossible to distinguish one from the other." The ladies, wishing to be polite and educated, were forced to agree to the literary scholar's proposal. They nodded reluctantly. The junior researcher of the Institute of Literature took a sip of cognac and began his summary of Chekhov's immortal work, The Seagull. Nina, a young girl, the daughter of a wealthy landowner, falls in love with Trigorin, who is a writer, with all the passion of a first love. Trigorin's companion is the actress Arkadina, Tripliva by her former husband. Unfortunately, this love ends tragically for Nina. Nina has a child with Trigorin, but the child dies. She goes to Moscow to meet Trigorin. Although the writer was momentarily enchanted by Nina, he soon returns to the actress Arkadina. Arkadina's son, Konstantin Tripliv, a tender-souled young man who dreams of becoming a writer, is in love with Nina. After Nina leaves, he attempts suicide. Tripliv nevertheless continues writing, wishing to become a famous writer, but joylessly. He cannot overcome his love for Nina. Nina becomes a provincial theater actress and visits her birthplace. Contrary to Tripliv's hopes, Nina still loves Trigorin. The play ends with Tripliv's suicide. There is a great deal of love in the play. Tripliv's love for Nina, Nina's love for Trigorin, Arkadina's love for Trigorin, the estate manager's daughter Masha Shamrayeva's love for Tripliv, the teacher Medvedenko's love for Masha, Shamrayev's wife Polina Andreevna's love for Dr. Dorn. These are all unhappy love stories. Unhappy love is the main theme of The Seagull, a comedy in 4 acts.
Good heavens, Helyu said, shrugging her shoulders. Why in Russian love stories, in Russian literature, is it always unhappy love? Dostoevsky, idiots and such, and yet unhappy love and suicides belong to the genre of comedy for them.
Mare began to support her friend. It is incomprehensible how The Seagull, in which there is so much unhappy love, suicide attempts, and suicides, can be a comedy. I, being an English philologist and knowing English literature, admire English gentlemen, English literature. There they don't kill women or themselves just like that. The love of gentlemen is open, hot, and passionate. And anyway, why should love be hidden, denied, or feigned? Noble feelings should be open, visible to all. Of course, sex, that is, intimate communication, that should be hidden from strangers' eyes. Although I read in some book that for the Negroes of an African tribe, it is eating that is an intimate, hidden activity. But sex is open, so to speak, transparent to the whole village.
Mare! Helyu exclaimed. Stop your nonsense!
At the same time, Helyu gathered herself. Undoubtedly, Englishmen and Germans too are true gentlemen. But Finnish bachelors, not so much. Though those who built the Muga port were quite decent, gave women instant coffee and pantyhose, and they also had marks. Mare stepped on Helyu's toe under the table, signaling that she had gone too far with her talk in front of the Estonian bachelors. Her words sounded even a bit indecent. The literary scholar and the political economist shrugged vaguely at the lady's opinions and remained modestly silent. Unfortunately, they had no Finnish marks in their pockets, nor instant coffee or pantyhose. Piano sounds drifted through the cafe ceiling. Upstairs, Helyu's student, the capricious girl, was currently practicing a rather complicated etude. For this, she had chosen an approaching train. That is, she was trying to mimic the noise of a train on the piano. At first, the approaching train could barely be heard, but gradually and steadily the roar increased and increased. Then a terrible cacophony of sounds was heard. It lasted for a long time, and then the train moved away. The sounds were heard more and more quietly. Only individual clacks of wheels at the rail joints were still heard, and slowly these too faded. But immediately a new train approached. Trains kept approaching and receding, approaching and receding. Echelons thundered over the heads of those sitting in the cafe, and people conversed calmly, sat quietly as if in a compartment with covered windows, and the noise of trains, the clacking of carriage wheels, belonged to their calm lives, even enlivened a quite monotonous, boringly monotonous, eventless life. Silently and dully, people sat in the cafe. Silently and dully, people passed by the cafe windows. Monotony and grayness had wrapped people into themselves, both inside the cafe and outside its walls. Only the train rode thunderingly, non-stop to who knows where. The talk turned back to literature. Elmar, being a lecturer in the political economy of socialism, had been given the task of completing a course at the Evening University of Marxism-Leninism to fulfill the faculty's political education plan. Having updated his philosophical knowledge there, he could now share it with his conversational partners. Philosophically speaking, our spirit, the spirit of us Estonians, still belongs to the European cultural space, although the physical body is geopolitically encompassed in the sphere of influence of Russia, that is, the Soviet Union. It seemed to Helmut as if the political economist was trying to intrude into a field that by right was his domain, and he immediately displayed his knowledge in literary history. All signs indicate that our literary classics, Wilde, Tammsaare, Douglas, were rather influenced by 19th century Russian literature. Over 200 years of Russian imperial rule in Estonia left its mark on our cultural history as a whole. For example, Douglas studied in a Paris school where the language of instruction was Russian, took part in the Revolution of 1905, was elected an academician of Soviet Estonia in 1946, and was awarded the title of People's Writer. True, a few years later the honorary title was revoked and he was expelled from the Writers' Union of the Estonian SSR. After Khrushchev's so-called thaw, Douglas was gradually restored to honor.
Helmut,
Mare said with indignation in her voice. But you forget that actually during the Tsarist era, the Baltic Germans ruled Estonia. They brought European culture right to our doorstep. And what thaw are you talking about? Khrushchev simply tried to wash himself clean of the bloodbaths committed during Stalin's time, blaming everything on Stalin and Beria. Elmar stepped in to support Mare. Khrushchev, in order to topple the myths glorifying Stalin, threw new, freshly baked myths, beneficial to himself, into the hall of the Palace of Congresses and the media at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party. The speeches of politicians are just the toppling of old myths and the creation of new ones, just like Helmut's dissertation. In reality, however, life follows its own unpredictable path. The unremarkable-looking man, reading a newspaper alone at the table, peeked again over the edge of the paper toward those at the table, lengthily and searchingly. Mare, with her feminine intuition, caught that look and did not develop the topic of Stalin's bloodbaths any further. For some time more, they argued about the delivery of culture, failing to reach a consensus on where more culture was brought to Estonia from, the East or the West. Having drunk their coffees and emptied their glasses, the group prepared to leave. A tedious workday lay ahead in the morning. At the end of the work week, on Friday, one could sit longer, and then the suitors' hearts beat at a faster pace than usual. Then the ladies allowed themselves to be walked home. When Helyu reached her apartment to finally stop the endless echelons of the piano student, the neighbors upstairs had also started making protesting noises, rolling dumbbells across the floor. The seagull gnawed at Helyu's heart. So much love, tears, suicides, out of love. God Almighty! Is such a thing possible in ordinary life? Or are all these loves, tears, vows of fidelity, disappointments and betrayals and suicides prompted by despair depicted in literary works merely a writer's literary devices, literary images, a comedy that has nothing in common with the life of an ordinary person. But apparently, books aren't written about the life of an ordinary person. Helyu stepped to her modest bookshelf and began searching with her eyes. After a moment, she pulled a book from the shelf. It was Anton Chekhov's Selected Stories. The Seagull, published by Eesti Raamat, Tallinn, 1968. The book's greenish-white design seemed somewhat old-fashioned to Helyu, but rather she felt in her heart that the book's striped design was so spinsterish. Helyu lit the floor lamp in front of the sofa, curled up on the couch and prepared to read, but rose a moment later, opened the sideboard, poured herself a glass of red wine from a half-full bottle, and having placed it on the coffee table and settled a sofa cushion comfortably under her side, she opened the first page of The Seagull. Helyu became immersed in reading. She suffered, felt disappointment and sometimes brief joy, as if she'd been drawn into the whirlpool of the tumultuous events of The Seagull, as if she were among the play's characters in the park of Soren's estate, and the sun had just set. From time to time, she still gave her eyes a rest and took a sip of wine. Outside it began to grow dark, but the streetlights had not yet lit up. Through the open balcony door, the footsteps of individual pedestrians drifted into the room. Someone walked with a dragging step, as if a workman tired from a hard day's labor were hauling himself home. For a while, silence reigned. Then steps of different tones and rhythms were heard at once. Here strode an official of high rank, or a manager of a large warehouse, a member of the Communist Party, in solid leather-soled shoes, with his wife trying to keep pace, pattering diligently on the man's arm. Again silence reigned, and again voices, click, 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 fast and light steps. Helyu felt a sting of envy in her heart. Only a girl in love, going to a date or coming from a date, walks so joyfully and happily. Helyu sighed. People walk on the street, go about their business, hurry where they need to, and they are not interested in any seagull. They are not interested in a dead seagull or a crow. The neutered cat, Mince, stretched himself in the armchair, arched his back comfortably with his tail up, stuck out his long pink tongue, looked at his mistress with momentary indifference, and curled up on the sofa again. Through the open balcony door came the strikes of the town hall clock. It was 12 o'clock. Time to go to bed. The cafe had closed its doors an hour ago. Not a single sound came from the street below. Life in the socialist camp followed the path predetermined by fate or the Communist Party. Helyu had already grown used to her new suitor, and now she affectionately called Helmut her little moron. Elmar still lectured on the political economy of socialism at the Pedagogical Institute, although neither he nor the students understood what this socialist political economy actually was. With capitalist political economy, everything was simple and clear. Man is a wolf to man. Everything is for sale, even over dead bodies for the sake of profit. But socialist political economy? Rubbish. Phooey. At the same time, some progress had still occurred in Elmar's life, a favorable development on the love front, so to speak. Namely, he had moved from the Institute's dormitory room, which he used personally as a lecturer, into Mare's place. Now they lived as partners, just like married people. Through her workplace, Mare had been allocated a 2-room apartment with a shared kitchen in a villa located in a park on the edge of town. It was the house of some wealthy merchant from the time of the First Republic, who had, however, disappeared into the expanses of Siberia during the 1941 deportations. Now, the house was divided into shared apartments among many in need of housing, and Mare was lucky. A door opened from her living room into the garden. On warm summer evenings, it was so nice to sit on the small terrace. A thin, white fog descended onto the meadow behind the park, but the air was warm, and Elmar sat right here, smoked, and sipped his 100 grams. One sunny day in May, Helmut personally called Helju, Mare, and Elmar and announced in a festive voice, "I defended my dissertation. I am now a candidate of sciences. Let's meet at 5 in the cafe. It's on me." The host of the party ordered 100 grams of cognac and coffee for everyone, and was just about to order the usual potato salad and Moscow bun when Helju stopped him gently. "Steady on, moron. To celebrate the defense of your dissertation, I ordered a cake. The waitress promised to let us cut it." The waitress standing by the table nodded in agreement. Bringing your own cake was a widespread custom when celebrating a birthday or an important event. Besides, a slice of cake was also left for the waitress. Helmut kissed Helju on the cheek. Helju squeezed his hand promisingly. Glasses were raised to the health of the fresh candidate of philological sciences. Success and strength were wished. A doctoral thesis lay ahead. Political economist Elmar, having quite quickly gotten a cricket in his head, gotten tipsy, began to crack a joke about the brand new candidate of sciences research. "Helmut, introduce your research more closely. Tell us which Russian words fertilize Estonian colloquial speech, or maybe even the written language. Well, komparte, komsomol, partorg, kultorg, priturka, blatnoi. But which others?" Helju, who had already become quite playful from the cognac, burst out laughing and said, "Pohui, yerunda, mat pere mat." The group laughed unanimously and benevolently. Helmut was not offended by Helju's antics, all the more so because these words were indeed widespread in Estonian colloquial speech and actually meant nothing. Only the man of unremarkable appearance, sitting a few tables away reading a newspaper, raised his head at Helju's words and looked with a dull expression toward the group roaring with laughter. Part 2. Time rolled on in its own way, and it seemed to the people of Estonia that everything would remain as it was. But suddenly, perestroika thundered, also a loan word from Russian enriching the Estonian language. Freedom of speech gained momentum, and then the singing revolution roared tempestuously. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of wildly cheering people, slightly tipsy with happiness, gathered at the Song Festival grounds and waved, kept waving blue, black, and white national flags, and sang themselves free. Helju and Mare sang at the Song Festival grounds together with Helmut and Elmar, together with the whole nation. Sometimes Helju jumped out in front of the singers and conducted, vigorously and devotedly. Soon Estonia declared itself independent, regained independence, separated from the Soviet Union. Estonia's 50-year stay in the brotherly family of the Soviet Union had ended bloodlessly. People breathed a sigh of relief. A new, free, and happy independent life in an independent Republic of Estonia lay ahead. In the life book of all Estonian people, a new page was turned at once. Candidate of philology, Helmut, and not only Helmut, but all Estonian people, used new, previously unknown words as if they were a matter of course. Words that took root not only in Estonian colloquial speech, but also in the written language. Privatization, grabbing, forced tenant, restitution, heirs of former owners. The orthographic dictionary was significantly supplemented with new words enriching the Estonian language, and this without linguists having to write scientific works and dissertations and labor to defend them. Soon, many, very many Estonian people realized that these new words enriching the Estonian language were not only used in poems, epics, and other literary works, but they also had deep practical meaning. When a person received a letter from some state institution, and if it contained even one of the aforementioned new words enriching the Estonian language, the recipient's heart began to pound with anxiety, and their legs became weak. That word could mean immense happiness or a terrible misfortune. For example, when the partorg and general director of a former large state factory received a letter from the privatization agency that the privatization plan they had submitted together had won and a contract for the privatization of the state factory would be signed with them. Then, undoubtedly, the legs of the factory's former Communist Party secretary and general director weakened with great happiness. But the legs of high school English teacher Mare weakened with a terrible fright. She received a letter from the city government which informed her in a laconic, bureaucratic tone that the house in the park at the edge of town, where her apartment was located, had been returned to the heir of the former owner. The city government official was still a human being, however, and gave good advice at the end of the letter. Mare should sign a lease agreement with the new house owner or move out. Having lived happily in an apartment with a shared kitchen all her conscious life, Mare now found herself in the state of an unhappy, forced tenant. The situation was more than terrible because the new owner, an heir living in London, based on market price, set the rent tariff at the average price of apartments in houses next to London's Hyde Park. A familiar lawyer, to whom Helyu turned for legal aid, explained that in the conditions of a liberal market economy, everything is possible. Comfort could not even be offered by the Old Deer Cafe located on the first floor of her home. The cafe was under renovation. It had been privatized by some foreigner, and soon a pub was to be opened in it. Helyu, not knowing exactly the nature and purpose of a pub, asked for explanations from her friend, the English philologist Mare. "A cheap drinking place in England," Mare said scornfully. "But for us, it will be a true den." In contrast, Elmar's life moved upward. He had become a professor of the political economy of capitalism at some private university. With this political economy, things were clear. Man is a wolf to man, everything for sale, etc., etc. Helmut had not exactly taken a high flight after Estonia's independence, but he was satisfied with life. He had hidden his candidate of philology diploma in a corner of a drawer and did not talk about it, because this very scientific work did not evoke any particular enthusiasm in the scientific circles of independent Estonia. Rather, they laughed with malicious joy. Now Helmut worked as an Estonian language teacher in a Russian school. Soon, a pink neon sign glowed above the door of the former cozy cafe. Pub. Along the street, against the wall of the house opposite up to the roof ridge, thumping music resounded, to which the screaming shouts of a soloist, erotic groans, and other sounds accompanying cheap commercial music occasionally gave an artistic coloring. Customers streamed in and out of the pub door, and each time through the open door the loud talk of those inside, swearing, the empty boasting and shouting of drunken people burst onto the street. The noise and thundering music of the pub seeped through the floor and walls of Helyu's room, through the windows and the balcony door, penetrated along the sewer pipes into the toilet and bathroom, and did not fall silent for a moment. Every evening, as she settled into bed, Helyu was struck by tremors of fear and horror, as if she were being led to the scaffold under the guillotine. She adjusted the pillow, crawled under the blanket, pulled the blanket over her head, and tried to fall asleep. But it did not succeed. Helyu rose, dragged herself to the kitchen, swallowed sleeping pills, drank water with tearful eyes, and climbed back under the blanket. Finally, she fell asleep. In the morning she woke up tired, with blue rings under her eyes, and gloomily and sadly prepared for work. The situation became particularly bad on weekends, when the party places in the old town closed their doors at 3 or 4 o'clock, and boisterous revelers stormed the pub to continue the party in this cheap drinking den, which was open until the early morning hours. Around 6 or 7, the revelers' friends appeared with cars, honking, slamming car doors, and trying to outdo each other with the music coming from the car radios. Some climbed onto the car roof, took a theatrical pose mimicking a Lenin monument, and sipped beer. Even tougher players stumbled on weak legs to their cars parked in front of the pub, fumbled for a long time at the car door, unable to hit the keyhole with the key, and having finally opened the door, slumped into the seat and sped away with tires screeching. Slowly, the pub emptied. The gangs of revelers standing on the streets dwindled. Upon the revelers' departure, empty beer cans, smashed bottles, and puddles of vomit, along with streams of urine flowing from the stairwell of the apartment next to the pub, remained to decorate the street. Helju, trying to adapt to the new situation, set up her sleeping place in the hallway in the evening. But even in the hallway, the noise coming from the pub did not let her fall asleep, and she dragged the mattress onto the stair landing. Here it was quieter at night, and only toward morning, when the customers began to leave the pub and a riot broke out on the street that made the hallway walls vibrate and shake, was Helju forced to rise. Her sleeping was done for this time. She could drag the mattress into the room and start preparing for work. Only on Saturday morning could Helju sleep quite tolerably on the stair landing, but in 2 shifts, from 12 midnight until 4, further until 7 in the morning, she had to listen to the hullabaloo on the street, which was clearly audible in the hallway. From 7 on, the area in front of the pub was empty, and silence reigned in the pub. Now Helju could slumber until 11 or even 12, unless urgent business lay ahead. But an unforeseen case also occurred. One Saturday night, around 3 o'clock, neighbor Mrs. Vera heard snoring behind her door and opened the door chain thinking a vagrant had settled down to sleep behind her door. Great was her surprise when she saw Helju sleeping on the landing. Thinking that the music teacher neighbor had gone mad, she called the police and the ambulance with trembling hands. First the ambulance arrived, then the police. The ambulance nurse, an experienced worker, gently shook Helju by the shoulder, woke her up, and meanwhile put a finger to her lips and whispered, "Be calm. We are just here by chance. Is it too hot to sleep in the room?" Helju looked at the nurse in misunderstanding at first, but then realized and told her case history. The ambulance paramedic, that is, the driver, opened the hallway door and stepped into the room, but from there a whole avalanche of the riot coming from the pub blasted at him. "Madhouse!" the paramedic exclaimed and quickly pulled the door shut. The police who arrived exchanged a few words with the nurse, shrugged their shoulders, and spread their hands. Finding that it was not a case within their jurisdiction, they sat in the car, turned on the flashing lights, and drove away with the siren wailing. A moment later, the ambulance followed. Now that times were different and customs were different, the pensioner neighbor Mrs. Vieira had begun to greet Helju as if she were a fellow sufferer, and coming from an evening walk, meeting Helju on the stairs, she even tried to start a conversation. But because of the noise coming from outside, the foul swearing and boisterous cheers, the lady's quiet voice could not be heard. The neighbors parted with a kind smile. One night, after a stressful workday, Helju woke up on her stair landing around 2 o'clock. Her head was throbbing terribly. The usual riot was boiling in the pub. The walls and ceilings shook from the thundering music and the shouts of the drunken pub patrons. Helju decided to call the police to ask for help. There, she was given good advice. Call the mayor. Matters related to entrepreneurship fall within his competence. Helju placed the phone on the table and sadly shrugged her shoulders. Call the mayor at 2 in the morning? The mayor will come at 2 in the morning and start organizing entrepreneurship. It could be so, and it can be so. But wasn't the police response to an ordinary person's plea for help too cynical? In a final resort, although writing letters of complaint was distasteful, Helju and Vera decided to write a letter of complaint to the mayor, asking for help to regulate the pub's business so that people in the building could get even a little rest at night. The city government's response was quick and polite. "Thank you for your letter. We are happy that we can help you. However, since issues related to entrepreneurship are complex, multifaceted, and taking into account that on one hand we are obliged to ensure the well-being of city residents, but on the other hand it is not appropriate to hinder the sustainable activities of an enterprise, we cannot give you an exhaustive answer immediately. At the same time, we remain with you and will inform you immediately of the measures taken. Respectfully, your city government, Public Relations Advisor." Another nightly riot in the pub, and on the street in front of the pub subsided toward morning. Silence arrived. The residents of the house fell into a heavy and deep sleep. Nothing predicted a geopolitical catastrophe. Helyu woke up on the landing around 11 o'clock, stretched on the mattress, arched with pleasure like Mince the cat, and sat up. It was Saturday. The sun glittered in the room, illuminating the street in front of the pub and the wall of the house opposite. Helyu went out onto the balcony and breathed in the freshness of the early summer day with a full chest. Her soul felt light and good. Both inside the house and outside its walls, silence and peace reigned. Today, Helyu was free from duties. On Saturday, the piano student, the spoiled daughter of the newly rich man, the former manager of the Soviet-era warehouse, drove to the summer house with her father. Thus, both Helyu and her old lady neighbor Vera could rest from the bratty student. Helyu set up the electric coffee pot while humming a song joyfully and began to fold the bedding. A day free from work lay ahead, which could be used for herself, going over the shelves with a dust cloth, tidying the kitchen and bathroom, and then walking a bit in the city, in the town hall square, to show herself and look at others. For the evening, a meeting with Mare, Elmar, and Helmut was planned at the City Park Cafe, their new favorite cafe, because sitting in the noise of the pub offered no peace to the senses or sustenance to the soul. From time to time, some late, or rather early, passers-by stopped at the pub door, tramped outside, and multilingual cursing and the foolish laughter of drunken people could be heard. They were looking for a hair of the dog, but the pub was closed. A sign, extremely rare for this establishment, hung on the door. Sanitary Day. Naturally, a commission was expected. From the direction of the city government building, across the large square, the sanitary commission moved toward the pub, consisting of the city sanitary advisor, 3 representatives of the city council, and 1 member of parliament. Behind them, at a respectful distance, strode a municipal police officer. The commission's path was, as always, paved with good intentions. The commission members walked at an easy pace, not rushing ahead of the city sanitary advisor nor falling behind him. They conversed about order, the noise on the street in front of the pub, the fights of drunks, the smell of urine in the stairwells of the apartments next to the pub, and the complaints of malicious house residents. The utterances, phrasing, and remarks of the commission members were so wise and relevant that the sanitary advisor was suddenly struck by a fit of enthusiasm. He turned to the entourage and voiced a thought that had just popped into his head. We should, gentlemen, come together more often like this and discuss, look around, check, inspect. It is simultaneously pleasant and necessary. You feel the value of your life's work knowing that you aren't spending the taxpayers' money just by sitting in an office. The Member of Parliament, a country person from Mulgama, and therefore a bit simple-minded and overly blunt, said, "Fully agree with you, Mr. Sanitary Advisor. But once the employer has already withheld income tax from the worker's salary and transferred it to the tax office, the taxpayer no longer has authority over that money, or, as we say in South Estonia, misquera sus se pini perses. What's in the dog's mouth is in the hound's arse." Well then, the sanitary advisor said mildly, not entering into an argument. The commission reached the pub and stood in a cluster at its door. The door was closed. The sign hung on it made it quite unambiguous. Sanitary Day, which in the common tongue meant get stuffed. The city sanitary advisor pressed his nose against the door glass and peeked in. Someone was busy behind the bar counter. "Step forward and show yourself," the sanitary advisor said to the municipal police. The mupo in the green uniform rose to the steps, pressed his shoulders against the glass, and moved his shoulders, making his epaulette stars shine. Immediately, an extremely benevolent mug, red with hospitality, looked back at the mupo through the glass. The foreign pub owner himself had appeared in person. The door was opened, and the pub owner greeted the newcomers familiarly in Estonian. Teriter, vannakere. Hello, hello, old body. The city sanitary advisor, being the chairman of the commission, did not let himself be deterred by the pub owner's overflowing kindness and said sternly, "You have excessive noise here until morning. Rock, heavy music and such. There are fights on the street. Residents complain." An administrator, a corpulent lady, broadly speaking like a bulldozer or local labor, began to share explanations on behalf of the pub owner. "What are you saying now, Mr. Inspector? We are so quiet, completely quiet. Look, here, under the counter, in a cake box. Little kitties are sleeping. Week-old kittens. Could they possibly endure noise?" The sanitary advisor put his hand into the cake box. "Good God, how soft. My little kitties. Tiny little noses, little tail stubs. I would take one kitten with me, but only a male." "Of course a male. Definitely a male," the administrator said serviceably. She lifted a kitten before the sanitary advisor's eyes. "Look, it is a male. A tiny little Tilu-Lilu, but he will grow. I'll pack the kitty into a little box, tie it with a ribbon and make a knot, easy to take by the fingertip." The pub owner said something quietly in English to the administrator. "Oh yes," the administrator exclaimed. "The kitten must be given a name, and we must have a health toast." The city sanitary advisor looked inquiringly at the commission members. They shrugged in agreement. "That we can do," said the sanitary advisor. "But only a shot. Work needs doing." Of course, the pub administrator agreed with the sanitary advisor. "I'll pour coffee right away, pour the cognac, bring the snacks. Herring, cheese, balik. The balik was brought by hand courier yesterday directly from Russia, across the Narova Bridge. Very good. Wait, where is my knife? I'll cut it right now." The sanitary advisor placed the kitten on the bar counter for the time being until the box was brought and it was packed inside. The kitten, having woken from sleep, let out a thin stream of pee on the bar counter and squeaked plaintively. "Look at that," the sanitary advisor said tenderly. "Peeing as if the little fellow had been drinking beer." The administrator placed the balik on the counter. The member of parliament grabbed the knife and cut himself a hefty piece, began to munch greedily. Cognac was poured and glasses were raised. "To the kitten's health." The party soon got into its proper swing. The municipal police officer quickly took several consecutive shots, spit into the balik, and, having gotten a fair cricket in his head, left quietly. Things could get messy here. The inspectors continued their work. In the meantime, the sanitary advisor felt the need to go and water the horses. The corpulent administrator said, blushing modestly, "Our toilet is constantly full of guests. They pee in the pot, and next to the pot. Even now, the city council representatives are in there. We, the pub staff, our own people, go out through the back door, onto the courtyard steps, and let the water go from the landing in the fresh air." The foreign pub owner, who was already quite full, confirmed his corpulent administrator's words. Yes, long live." The city sanitary advisor stepped into the dark corridor, felt for the door by hand, happened to open the door of a wall cupboard that met his reach, let the water go with a shiver of pleasure in his shoulders, and said to himself romantically, "Tonight is so dark. Not a single star is visible." The day was leaning toward evening when the commission left the pub, and it was also high time. A quite numerous group of thirsty people had already gathered outside the door, loudly demanding to be let in. Some of them could barely stand and let water go against the house wall while swaying on their legs. The hinges of the stairwell door of the apartment next to the pub were already quite rusty from it. A police car, with flashing lights and siren wailing, drove through the crowd in front of the pub. Some of them hid under an archway, while others, whose consciences were cleaner, drew back to the edge of the sidewalk. The police in the car turned off the flasher and siren and burst out laughing merrily. A moment later, the police car disappeared into a side street. "Oh, how pleasant. The workday is behind us," the city sanitary advisor said with a soft tongue, stepping from the pub door onto the street. The little box with the kitten hung by a thin string from the tip of his finger. The sanitary advisor was followed by 2 city council representatives, arm in arm, and at the very end, the member of parliament, who waved a large chunk of balik as if it were a club. Seeing such a group exiting the pub in an extremely militant mood, ordinary pub guests respectfully drew aside. Old Mrs. Vera, who was coming from a late-night church concert, hoped to slip through the gang of men to drop herself inside her home door, but it proved impossible. They were of the opinion that the lady wished to push into the pub without queuing. Vera tried to swing her handbag at a stocky fellow who shoved her brutally away, but accidentally hit the pub door glass. It shattered into fragments. A security guard jumped out and twisted the old lady's hands behind her back. This time, a police patrol was also immediately on the scene. A misdemeanor report was drawn up for the lady.
I will appeal to the court.
Mrs. Vera shrieked in a shrill voice across the street.
I'll show you misdemeanor. I'll show you laws. I'm a poor pensioner. I will apply for state legal aid and go to court. I will go to court until Judgment Day.
The police car drove away, but the incident had brought the revelers carousing on the street into a state akin to euphoria. The audience expressed dissatisfaction with the behavior of the penskar. Penskar, a new, contemptuous word find, meaning an old person or pensioner with a wretched lifestyle and few means of subsistence. With unrestrained roaring, piercing whistling, foul swearing, and bellowing. Some group started a huddle dance on the street. 2 security guards in black uniforms threw a man with a fat red face out of the pub door onto the street. He flew belly first onto the cobblestone pavement. The security guards jumped on his back and began to twist his arms. The man on the ground screamed like an animal. The whole street was filled with bursts of laughter and shouts of encouragement. Some drunk girls poked the security guards with their feet, some of them the fat man with the red face. And then the girls turned to fight among themselves, plucking hair and screaming hysterically. Tired from the day's chores and the hot weather, Helyu lay in her nightgown on the bedspread and tried to rest, so that a bit later she could drag the mattress onto the landing and go to sleep. But the noise coming from the street and the pub became crazier and crazier. Helyu was struck by dizziness, and suddenly she felt how the geopolitical catastrophe collapsed upon her, trampling her, tearing with claws and teeth, and meanwhile it roared terrifyingly. Helyu rose in a state of mental confusion, grabbed a tea kettle from the kitchen, rushed to the balcony and splashed water down onto the rioters below. It was like irritating a wasp's nest. Empty beer cans clattered against the balcony door and the metal railing. Some half-empty beer cans flew through the open balcony door into the room. Puddles of beer spread out on the floor. Uncontrolled, understanding nothing, Helyu rushed down the stairs in her nightgown and barefoot and exited onto the street. With monstrous force, she pushed through the roaring mob, meanwhile let out a wild and horrific shriek and ran screaming madly toward the large square offering protection and freedom. Whether the destination of her run, a desperate desire to find help, was prompted by animal instinct or madness, she ran toward the city government building, appearing as if through a fog.
Thank you for listening. To discover more stories, follow the link in the description below.